first question that is intriguing is the question of how both of us began poetry and our interest in poetry. And I have a very strong recollection of being probably 3 years old and being at Lionel's house on the Koppie, playing with my brother on the swing. And Lionel had invited both of my parents for his annual poetry reading / Christmas party. And I remember so clearly my mother sitting in the audience and tears streaming down her face while Lionel read his Jacaranda poem. And I remember being very intrigued by that because I was interested in the fact that she was so moved by something that was only words. And at that time I didn't understand words. But Lionel was the first poet I'd ever been introduced to, and I think will always be my favorite poet. And I was so lucky because of that. So I'd like to ask Lionel actually where his interest in poetry began.
Well, I appreciated poetry. I felt strongly about it at school, but the big moment, I think, came when I was visiting a friend's house. I'd fairly recently got to know Sandy and Doreen, and we were sitting talking, and this little girl, about 4 or 5 years old, came up to the door of where we were sitting and said, "Come here." So I said, I got up, and she said, "Down here," and she walked down the corridor, and I said, and she ducked into a doorway and said, "In here," and I followed her in, and she said, "Sit there," at the bottom foot of the bed, and I sat there, and she jumped into bed, pulled up the covers and said, "Now, tell me a story." I was a first-year student, intellectual, never told a story in my life. And so I said, "Once there was a little girl. She climbed a stalk up into a flower, pushed away through firm, cool petals, walked a pollen-crumbly field to its very centre, and there she sat. And she was pleased with it."
And that little girl was?
Shirley Wilson, who is now a grandmother with several grandchildren, and she tells magical stories to her grandchildren, and she attributes them to my influence on her.
So I have a question for both of you. First of all, how did you meet this lovely young lady?
Well, I've known her parents for years, at the Art Foundation particularly. And I guess one of the early times was at the party she told us of.
And how old was she back then?
I was probably about 3 years old.
3 years old?
Yeah.
Okay. And what was it about Lionel's poetry that really captivated you?
Possibly that the tremendous evocativeness of Lionel's poetry, even from a young age, the great sensuality of it. And there's always been a childlike quality, a very whimsical quality to his work, sense of humour. And if I had to describe, if I look across the poets to which I'm always attracted, I think those features always group them together still as an adult. So I think from a young age, Lionel informed my taste in poetry. And Lionel was also really very much an entertainer. He embodied the figure of a poet. He lived the life of a poet. And so he was always a very prominent figure in my imagination, even when I was at school, even for example.
How many years have you been friends with the family?
With Amanda, that would be giving her her present age.
Okay.
I'm not embarrassed about that. So yeah, no, he's known. I'm 28 now.
Okay.
And Lionel, I've got a book from Lionel, his Winterman, signed by him 1993. So I was 3 years old then.
Okay. And then before that, how long do you go back with her dad?
Her dad and mom, back to when I started the Art Foundation, her mom anyway, that would be about 1980.
Okay.
And then, met her dad later, and we collaborated on a book. He had taken the photographs, I wrote the introduction. And he was the hardest person to write for, because he took nothing for granted and everything got thrown back and said, but you can get it more intense. And eventually it was the most intense, wonderful introduction.
Which is exactly what he did with the photographs that you painted on.
Yes.
Throw it back and throw it back and throw it back.
Reworked, yeah. He's still throwing, I think. At least I hope.
What is it about poetry that enthralls you, Mr. Murcott?
Poetry is a number of things. If I can go back before I started writing, I was appreciating poetry. I was identifying with what the poet said. I was carried on his tide of words. And then when I eventually started writing poetry, it was partly a delight in those words, partly a necessary therapy. I got myself into some awful situations, and writing about it was the only way I could cope.
So words are a way to let go of things and to heal and to find a way forward.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'd like to add to that, I've always loved the word. There's a kind of alchemical word in psychoanalysis called sublimation. And I've always loved that word because there's something, the transformative process that happens in poetry. That poetry mirrors not only back your experience, but it mirrors back the complexity of your experience and certainly the beauty of your experience. There's a very heightened sense of reality that one gets from writing a poem. And it's very much a transformative process.
Do you think that in South Africa people have lost touch with the importance of poetry?
So if we look at the international climate of poetry, I think there's certainly been given a breath of new life by, as everything has been, by social media. So there are what we call today social media poets. But certainly people are far more detached from language than the traditional Western canon than they used to be. But if we look at South Africa, it's very interesting. There's a huge growth of spoken word. And it very much picks up on the African tradition of oral poetry and of oral language. So yeah, there's a very interesting change in poetry, but certainly people are detached from the traditional poetry used to learn in schools.
Do you think that poetry transcends cultural barriers and boundaries? Do you think it tells stories that are more human, both of you, that are more human and more connected to the human experience than the cultural experience?
My own struggle as a person has always been the straddling between my intellectual identity and my artistic identity. And I think what poetry is able to do is, instead of abstracting from experience, which is what sort of academic work does, academic writing, it brings you closer to the heart of personal experience. And so it achieves a great intimacy with anyone, but in that sense moves greatly from the particular to the universal. Because it's about sort of the sharing of the great complexity and privacy of one's inner world, that one really can connect with anyone. Then there are deeper questions about the nature of language and about of the nuance of different languages, and I think that's very probably particular to culture and very difficult for someone to grasp across nations. It's very difficult for me to understand the nuance in Israeli poetry, for example. But that's just got to do with the nature of language itself.
I was picking up some of the words, intimacy, particular, I've forgotten the others, I had a list of them in my head. But it's the individual, particular, sensuous experience rather than the ideological barrier.
Because poetry is essentially, I said this the other day, it's phenomenological. It's got to do with the what it is likeness of experience.
Oh, that's awesome.
And the strawberryness of being a strawberry. And ultimately it's about the quality of being oneself and how one expresses that, what it's like to be in one's own internal reality.
I said to an artist yesterday when he asked me about Lionel's work, I said that if I had to work broke for the rest of my life to sell Lionel's work, I would continue to sell it because it is so honest and so raw and so real, and whether or not you like it is irrelevant. It's whether you take the time long enough to engage and look at it and understand it. And poetry, certainly for me, is something I grew up with. I went to the Eisteddfod and I did the Jabberwock, and I won the Pretoria Eisteddfod. And you lose contact with words the older you get, the more you busy yourself with life. And one of the reasons I've come back into art is to not be intellectualizing it, to be connecting to it and feeling it. But to get people to sit down for 5 minutes and engage, it's extremely difficult because we've all got these barriers and these walls up around us. I find incredibly interesting that between the two of you, you are a 70-year-old man sitting with a 28-year-old young lady, and age is irrelevant when we're talking about emotional value. So why the poetry reading together?
Well, one reason is that Amanda has a book that's just been published, hasn't yet been formally launched, and I thought, wow, let's celebrate the book. I'm also, suppose, celebrating the long connection with her and her family. Yeah, she's prettier than me.
There I would have to agree, Mr. Murcott.
I think that young people really underestimate the importance of artistic mentorship. And I've always been someone who's yearned for that. I've always sort of, for some reason, found myself with, I don't know why, older kind of wise men. It's an interesting figure. And there's always been a search for that in my life. But that what better than to share in the sort of legacy of poetry with someone who's so established. And so I just feel honored because one doesn't, the riches of that experience cannot be transmitted in a classroom, cannot be transmitted in a university lecture. One has to be in the presence of that person, which we've actually shared that because Lionel helped me to edit my poetry, to really, I suppose, glean from the riches of what they have to offer. So mostly I hang around Lionel to learn from him.
So do I. So do I.
And he drops off. Sometimes he says things, I suppose, that I don't, and everyone does this, but that he says things that he doesn't even realize are so rich, and I collect them like a little scavenger.
That's awesome. Why do you combine verbal and visual images?
I suppose because I do both at various times, and putting them together means it's a more complete picture of who I am and what I do. That's one reason.
Do you feel that sometimes a word on a paper with an image gives it better meaning or directs the meaning, or just accentuates the meaning?
I think that they come in from different angles, and the one will enrich the other and the other will extend the one.
Okay.
So to add to that, I'm interested in not necessarily the visual and verbal product, but the visual and verbal processes. And I'm actually a printmaker, so I think there's a very interesting relationship between poetry and printmaking, in the sense that they both require tremendous discipline and craftsmanship and technical expertise, but at the same time a sense of kind of chance, playfulness, and happenstance. And so I like poetry because there is some sort of wordsmithmanship required, and unfortunately, in the context of the rest of the art world where people get away with murder, it's a tremendous relief, I suppose, and that there's a sense of sort of meritocracy when it comes to poetry.
You said something earlier that was very interesting, and it's one of the things that I find that we kind of distanced ourselves from in the gallery was the intellectual. Sometimes puts very strong borders on your vision and your understanding. And do you find that Lionel's lack of needing to live within borders gives you a freedom that you feed off?
No, I think that, to be honest, I think I resonate with Lionel because that's to my philosophy, and I myself have been very censored in the intellectual and academic system. And I also have found that poetry and art itself has become extremely politically correct and commodified and commercialized. And for me, that's tremendously frustrating. And Lionel has a very profound poem that he's going to read in the reading about the nature of art and the sort of the primacy of experience and of honoring art for art's sake. And I think that I grew up in a family where creativity was the way that we breathed. So for me, I create in order to live. And so it's a very different philosophy than trying to make money or trying to kind of make a political statement. Although one can always make a political statement or earn money by simply being oneself.
Sure, absolutely. Which I think is one of the things that we strive for, is that the intellectual side is so important, because people look at an image or hear a poem and they don't understand the value of what was put into it.
Well, mostly it's intellectualization is a defense against not knowing or uncertainty or fear of feeling. So,
what do you want people to take away from the reading?
That's a good question. I guess a sense of shared richness, a sense of I have received your experience, your process. I have carried away something that beyond perhaps what I expected. Maybe that's something of it. And there should be some good stories in it too.
And some laughter.
Interestingly, growing up, I don't remember, if you won't certainly remember, but you might remember Ballen and pot roast, and there were great storytellers when I was growing up, and my Afrikaans gene, are you Jewish?
Yes.
Okay, so the Jewish gene is also, it's storytelling. So interestingly, Trevor Coleman was out last night, and somebody came up to him who's a cousin of his, who in the Jewish community is very well to do, and walked up to him. I think at Max, there was a book reading last night, Max. Anyway, walked up to Trevor and said to Trevor, I hear that you are highly collectible. And he said he was so astounded. And interestingly, what we've always said is that we can't make art better. We can only tell the story. And when people know the story, they attach to it better. So we are completely sold in terms of stories being important. Is the storytelling between the two of you going to be something that we're going to see every single year?
Gee, that's
Is that something that we can look forward to as building?
It's a long way ahead we're talking.
We have to be very prolific as poets.
But surely we can visit poems from the past?
Yeah, we can.
I don't have as much of a history.
Building a history, there we go. What else would you like us to know?
I hinted at how important it was to read poetry, and preferably to read it aloud. My reading of so many different poets, Chaucer and Wordsworth and Yeats, out loud. I used to go for long walks with a poetry book and read. I used to drive down to Durban from Maritzburg and see whether I could, or how many poems of Yeats's I could recite without looking down at my book. And that gives one a sense of poetry being located in the mouth.
It's a very interesting question. It's the same question that's been haunting classical music theoreticians, and that's the question of performance and whether, there's been an interesting debate in classical music around the fact that are we to locate the essence of the music, the existence of the music in the scores that were left behind, or in those actual performances? And we were saying how important it is that each voice carries a poem so differently, and that a poem actually exists in its reading of it, in one sense, and in another sense it exists in a literary format. So it has two existences.
So the delivery is vitally important.
I think so.
I would agree with it. I certainly would. And I like the age gap and that it's male and female. I like the fact that one of the things that we've really been moved at is that Lionel, at the age of 70, has been painting consistently for decades. And now younger people are starting to resonate and kind of attach to his work. And we don't spend enough time with mentors, with people who have traveled the journey before us. So our last poetry reading was fantastic, and we certainly look forward to this one. I think it's going to be very, very exciting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else we want to say?
Process. When I was teaching in Ishawe, a friend of mine ran the little library that got books every month from Durban. And she came up with a book called Understanding Poetry by Brooks and Warren. And in it there was a chapter on intention and meaning, how poems come about. And in that section there was a journey from the first scribble on the back of an envelope to a finished poem, stage by stage, pushing round, cutting out, adding in. The Woman at the Washington Zoo by Randall Jarrell. And that poem inspired me to start writing poetry. The fascination with process and the realization, you don't arrive by knowing what it's going to be like, you arrive by pulling the end of a piece of string, and when you've got to the other end of that string, you know you've got the whole thing.
And also there's something divinely inspired about poetry. I was listening to an interview with Bob Dylan about that, and I mean, it's the ancient concept of the muse, but that sometimes you don't know how you came to write that, or how there's something very magical about it. It's not the same as really grafting a piece of writing. You have to craft it very carefully, but there's something that animates you. There's something that's higher than you that often you think inspires that piece of work, and often if you try to rewrite that, it's very, very difficult. So to explain to someone how you came to write that.
You launch out, you swim.
Yes.
Do you think when you read
words arrive?
Well, so here's interesting. Whenever I do an interview with people, it's always interesting. You try to relate it to yourself, so you tell a little bit of your story so that you get a little bit of their story. And interestingly, when you listen to a poem, or you watch a story, or you see a painting, it's how you relate it to you. So what you're saying is, during the reading, you're wanting people to dig deep within themselves and find what the meaning is for themselves within your narrative.
I like that.
Yes?
Well, there's always Roland Barthes wrote about the death of the author. I always see poetry, as all art forms, as a form of giving birth and releasing into the world. And language is very much that way. There's no injection of meaning, where even language takes on different connotations and meaning for the recipient of that language, or the reader. And so it's always, for me, it's got a life sort of separate from me. And I think that's what's exciting about it. And I'd hope not for someone to see so much of me in it. I think great art speaks for itself and has its own life.
We completely agree with that. Anyway, I'm going to inject stories again.
That's another intellectualization, I think.
Yeah.
Is to write an autobiography like Vincent van Gogh did. Vincent van Gogh is very much known for his ear, so.
Have you read the book?
Which one? The letters.
Vincent, yes.
Yes.
Have you?
What, Theo? And the letters?
Yeah, the new one.
Oh, no.
The new one. It's phenomenal.
I want to see that movie.
It's the
animated one.
It got panned to hell by what's her
Robin
name?
Sasson. Yeah.
That's it.
I think so.
I think we got everything. Just let me, before I switch off. Who is the greatest South African poet that has inspired you? South African.
South African. That old toppy Douglas Livingstone, who died some years ago.
Okay.
But I think for me he's wonderful.
I also love him.
Oh, really?
But I love Lionel's work, and I love Lionel Abrams' work.
Lionel Abrams is another.
Who was actually a key, important teacher of Lionel's, and a very important figure at the Art Foundation too. And I think a lot of my own experience, or my attraction to Lionel, is so that I could have a vicarious experience of the Art Foundation. It was such a pivotal place in my parents' life and in the city.
Oh, that's amazing.
And as a child I was there, but I always yearned for it, and I think probably you were kind of a relic of the Art Foundation. So was my mom. She taught there for years, and it was an incredible community, and I think that's what, we speak of mentorship so much, what artists I think really yearn for in the city, is a hub.
I sometimes think this community is becoming a little bit like the Art Foundation, with that interchange, with that challenging, with that new work coming out of the challenges.
Which is exactly why we opened up the art space. Was interestingly, I was saying to somebody, we never thanked for the money. We're always thanked for the investment in terms of time, in terms of belonging to a family. So I love what you said about experiencing the past through them. If I had enough money to just sit and listen to the stories all day, at Lionel's 70th birthday party, everybody sat around in that big circle and listened, and I stood there thinking, stories are so important. So we look forward, thank you very much for the time, and we look forward to the reading.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.